It's 1991, and you've just heard of a brand new play that's premiering in town. You're in Sackville, New Brunswick, attending Mount Allison University, and posters for the new production by Live Bay Theatre are everywhere. The company was founded by former alumni Randy White, Anne Rowley, and Charlie Reindress. They have a history of producing original and established plays, musicals, and reviews that show off the Maritimes, and this show is supposed to be awesome because it's about an 18-year-old woman from Nova Scotia who was supposedly haunted by a number of ghosts. Maclean's magazine called her story, quote, Canada's most famous ghost story and a classic poltergeist case, end quote. And word has gotten out because the production has sold out its entire run. On your way to the theater on this mid-August night, you hear that there's a storm on the horizon, but it won't make landfall for a couple of days. You enter the theater, take your seat, and as the lights dim, you hear a loud boom. Then the lights flicker. A nervous giggle cascades across the audience, and then you hear someone whisper. Whenever something weird like that happens, it's Esther or her ghost, Bob. I'm Nadine Bailey, and this is Haunted Canada. Join me as I share the details of the great Amherst mystery. For today's story, we travel to a small town in northwestern Nova Scotia. You'll find it at the northeast end of the Cumberland Basin, which is an arm of the Bay of Fundy, and about 22 kilometers south of the Northumberland Strait, close to the border with New Brunswick. The town is named after Geoffrey Amherst, 1st Baron Amherst, a British general and governor of Quebec. He was the commander-in-chief of the British forces in North America during the 7 Years' War. It was established in 1764, 2 miles west of its present location, following the expulsion of the Acadians, which you might remember I talked about in the old Yarmouth jail episode. In case you need a refresher, Acadians are the descendants of French settlers who first arrived between 1604 and 1755 in what would become Eastern Canada. They established colonies on rich farmland and became allies with the Mi'kmaq. During the 7 Years' War, the British and New England militant expelled many of them from the area by force in what became known as the Great Expulsion. Many were sent as far away as New Orleans. The expulsion proved unnecessary and was later deemed inhumane, but it continues to be a sad part of Nova Scotia's history. But after the war, New Englanders were invited to settle many communities along the shores of the Bay of Fundy, and one of these became Amherst. The original settlement was located about 2 miles west of the present-day town. A grist mill was constructed nearby, and residents gradually moved closer to the mill and the current town site. By 1850, Amherst was located where it is today. 30 years later, the railway reached the town, which helped many local manufacturers, including the Amherst Boot and Shoe Company, Christie Trunk and Bag Company, and the Amherst Piano Company. Many of their buildings along Victoria Street are still standing today, and by 1908, the town became known as Busy Amherst because of the community's tremendous industrial growth. Amherst was a manufacturing hub, but the small town was famous around the world thanks to one young woman named Esther Cox. Esther Cox was born on Wednesday, March 28, 1860, in Upper Stewiacke, Nova Scotia, and named after her mother, Esther. Her parents were farmers, and she was the youngest of 6 children. As a tiny baby, she had to be kept on a small pillow for safety until she was 9 months old. Sadly, her mother never got to see that because she died from complications 3 weeks after giving birth to her, and her father, Archibald, became a widow. He soon remarried and moved to Maine with his new wife. Archibald left his 6 children behind to be raised by the grandmother. Even though their father had abandoned them, the siblings were surrounded by love. They all worked hard and pitched in as much as they could to the household. In 1878, their grandmother died. By then, Esther was 18 years old and heartbroken by the loss. Her sister Olive was a homemaker and lived nearby with her husband Daniel Teed, a foreman at the Amherst Shoe Company, with their 2 children, Willie, age 5, and Dan, aged 1. Daniel's brother John also lived with them, so things got crowded when Esther and her 2 siblings, William and Jane, also moved in. Esther promised to help care for her 2 nephews, the chickens and cows, and assist Olive in taking care of the small yellow wood-framed house at 6 Princess Street. The book, A Haunted House, compiled by Roy A. Seitz, describes the house as having a small front yard which was enclosed by a picket fence that extended towards the back to the stable. The square home had a gable roof with a bay window on the left and the front door on the right. The windows let the sunlight into the parlor, which was often filled with beautiful geraniums in a variety of colors. There was a dining room with an old-fashioned clock and many homemade rugs, chairs, and a large table to accommodate the growing family. The kitchen had a wood stove, a large pine table, and a washstand with a back door opening to the yard and stable. The cottage's second floor had 4 bedrooms, 2 in the front of the house, each with its own window overlooking the front yard, and 2 in the back, each with its own window as well. According to a photo I found online, the fence was in the beginning stages of collapsing, and the house was in disrepair at the time the picture was taken. I also found a picture of Esther. She was a beautiful young woman with a pale complexion, deep-set eyes, a sharp jawline, a strong nose, full lips, and a beautiful smile with perfect teeth. She was petite and had curly dark brown shoulder-length hair pinned back in the style of the times. Her eyes were gray with a bluish tinge, and she was described as having a stand-offish demeanor, which didn't help her on a dark and cloudy summer evening when her world was forever changed. On Wednesday, August 28, 1878, Esther was sitting on the front porch singing the popular Christian hymn, The Sweet By and By S. Fillmore Bennett, in a low voice. Her song was soon interrupted by the sound of a horse and buggy approaching. It was around 7:50 p.m. when Bob McNeil, a local young man she liked, pulled up to the house. He jumped down from the 2-seat buggy, opened the gate to the picket fence, walked into the yard, and asked Esther if she would like to go for a ride. Bob had been described as a shoemaker by trade. He was handsome, well-built, with dark hair, dark eyes, and a small black mustache that was fashionable at the time. But there was something about Bob that Esther's sisters disliked, and they often tried to persuade her against dating him. Daniel, Esther's brother-in-law, was Bob's supervisor at the Amherst Shoe Company, and he knew he had a reputation as a wild fellow. He discouraged young Esther from becoming entangled with him, but she was headstrong and ignored their advice. So when he stopped by on that August evening, she ran upstairs, grabbed her hat, and got into the buggy. Bob and Esther drove off through Amherst towards Tannamarach Marsh, a tidal salt marsh around the Bay of Fundy near Sackville, New Brunswick. As they rode, Esther was surprised when Bob suddenly pulled the buggy over in a remote wooded area and pointed a gun at her. Suddenly, she was terrified and unsure what to do when he ordered her to get out of the buggy. At first, she refused and remained firmly in the buggy. Bob got angry and ordered her out again, and again she refused. With each refusal, he became angrier and angrier. Rain started to fall, and in the distance, Bob heard the sound of another wagon approaching, and fearing he would be caught threatening Esther, he put away his revolver, turned the buggy around, and drove Esther home. The couple rode in complete silence to the sound of horses' hooves and heavy rainfall. Esther finally made it home at 10 p.m. The horses had barely stopped when she jumped from the buggy and bolted into the house. She didn't speak to anyone. She just ran up to her room and cried herself to sleep. What really happened on that ride varies, because another version says Esther was attacked and sexually assaulted by Bob, who was known to be a cruel man who skinned cats to watch them suffer for his own amusement. Either way, it seems that Bob McNeil, Esther's attacker, left Amherst the very next day, leaving her in great distress from a terrifying experience. A week later, strange things began to happen. On Wednesday, September 4th, Esther was sleeping in the bed she shared with her sister Jane. In the middle of the night, she jumped up and let out a piercing scream. Then, she claimed that there was a mouse under the bed. Half asleep and confused, Jane lit the oil lamp. She shined the light all over the room, under the bed, lifted up the bed sheets, and found nothing. Consoled by Jane's care, Esther settled down, and the two got back into bed and fell fast asleep. The very next night, the two sisters heard a piercing scream again. This time, they lit the oil lamp and pulled a green box from underneath the bed. Jane slid the box into the center of the room. When the box came to a stop, it leaped a foot off the floor and landed on its side. The terrified sisters began screaming. Daniel Teed, their brother-in-law, ran into the room to investigate the commotion. When Esther and Jane told him about the leaping box, he laughed at them and told them to get back to bed. The next day, Esther went about her chores, helping Olive around the house, then left for a long walk throughout town. She returned home, but that evening, she felt feverish and went to bed early. When Jane went to bed, she found Esther fast asleep. She got into bed, and just as she was dozing off, she felt the sheets rustle. She opened her eyes to find Esther sitting up in the bed, and just as she was about to ask her what was going on, Esther began screaming that she felt like she was about to die. Jane was terrified and went to light the oil lamp, but when she looked back, she saw that her sister was now standing in the center of the bedroom. She described that Esther was, and I quote, wearing a white nightgown with her short hair standing on end. Her face was as red as blood, and her eyes looking as if they were about to burst out from their sockets. Her hands held onto the back of the chair so tightly that her nails had sunk into the soft wood. End quote. Meanwhile, the rest of the family burst into the girl's bedroom at the sound of the screaming. They tried to calm Esther down. They helped her back into bed, but noticed that she had a burning fever. Esther seemed to be in a great deal of pain and began to swell as she told her family that she felt like she was going to burst. Then 3 violent booms were heard. They shook the small house. The experience terrified the family, but it seemed to calm Esther, who fell into a deep sleep almost immediately. By the next morning, it was as if nothing had happened. Esther was back to normal. Fearing judgment, the family decided that it was best not to tell anybody about what had happened. Little did they know that things were about to get much worse. Four days later, on Tuesday, September 10th, Esther was once again not feeling well and went to bed early with a fever. Jane joined her later, and as they lay asleep in bed, they were both jolted awake by an unknown force that pulled the bed covers off them and flew them into the corner of the room. The women screamed, and the family ran in to find Esther and Jane lying in the bed. The bedsheets were in a heap in the corner. Olive picked them up to cover the girls, only to have the sheets ripped off them again and thrown back in the corner. Esther's pillow was then ripped from underneath her head and thrown across the room. Then a large boom shook the house, just as it had done a few nights earlier, and with it, Esther fell back into a deep sleep. The next day, the family contacted the local doctor, who thought it was a joke, but agreed to come by the house later that evening. At 10 p.m., the doctor arrived, but by then, Esther and Jane had already gone to bed and were fast asleep, so he sat in the corner on a stiff wooden chair. Throughout the night, he witnessed as the pillow was ripped mysteriously from underneath Esther's head as he was shaken from his chair by a loud boom. He looked around the room to find where the sound was coming from, but it seemed to follow him as if it wasn't connected to anything. The bedsheets were ripped again off the two young girls, and the room was filled with scratching sounds and bangs. Then the words, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill," appeared on the wall just above the head of Esther's bed. The next morning, Esther was in the basement doing her chores when out of nowhere, she ran up the stairs, scared and out of breath. She said that someone or something had thrown a piece of wood at her. The doctor was called back to the house again. He took her down to the basement to show her that nobody was there. But as soon as they both stepped in, potatoes began flying at them. Over the next few nights, the loud bangs continued in the house. It was described like it sounded like someone was hitting the roof with a sledgehammer. These were believed to be poltergeists. From the German word meaning noisy spirit, they are a type of mischievous ghost or spirit often associated with unexplained physical disturbances like loud noises, objects moving, and even physical contact with people. And their activities around Esther continued over the next several months until October 1878, when they had become more aggressive. By the fall, Esther complained of being chased by objects as furniture was flipped over. But the poltergeist began to communicate by answering questions through knocks or writing on walls. Most of the written messages were too profane to be published in newspapers. However, the sensational "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill" got national attention. The Montreal Star newspaper sent a reporter to Amherst to investigate. He wrote a full column about what was now being dubbed the Great Amherst Mystery. Many locals were happy to be interviewed by the paper, including Reverend Temple, who said he had witnessed a bucket of drinking water boil all on its own in Esther's house. However, he denied supernatural activities and instead explained it as natural. Other witnesses said they had conversed with the ghost by asking it questions and receiving rapid answers. At one point, the ghost lit matches and threatened to burn down the Teed home. Suddenly, matches rained down from the ceiling as 2 unexplained fires were soon discovered. By January 1879, Esther moved in with a local family, but the poltergeist followed her. While most neighbors were curious about the ghostly activity and were sympathetic, others were less kind. Many did not believe her and accused her of being responsible for the phenomenon. She was treated unkindly by locals and by the ghost, who frequently slapped, pricked, and scratched her, and on one occasion stabbed her in the stomach with a clasp knife. In late March of 1879, Esther traveled to St. John, New Brunswick, where she was inspected by gentlemen with an interest in science. Through their investigation, they found several disembodied beings had attached themselves to Esther. They would eventually identify themselves as Maggie Fisher, her sister Mary Fisher, Peter Cox, Jane Nicol, Eliza McNeil, and Bob Nicol, who claimed to have been a shoemaker in a past life. At this point, Walter Hubble, a writer, actor, and self-professed debunker of fake mediums and hoaxers, heard Esther's story. Hubble moved into the cottage to investigate. His initial goal was to expose Esther Cox as a fraud. Instead, he became a believer. He arranged for a tour in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, where he would tell her story while Esther sat on stage. When audiences attended, they expected for ghosts to appear, and when this failed to happen, a particularly rowdy crowd ran the pair out of town. The tour ended soon after, but Hubble went on to publish his account of Esther's story in July of 1879. The book, called The Haunted House, sold 55,000 copies, and the New York Sun called it, quote, "probably the greatest tale of its kind in this or any other age," end quote. The book became a success and was later retitled The Great Amherst Mystery. Meanwhile, because of the book's success, Esther was forced to board with a family outside Amherst. When their barn burned to the ground, Esther claimed that the ghosts had done it. However, she was charged with arson and sentenced to 4 months in jail. She was released after a month, and one of the first things she did was visit a First Nations medicine man who helped her remove the demons. By then, Esther had been so traumatized that for the rest of her life, she refused to talk about the supernatural events that occurred in Amherst, Nova Scotia. Esther Cox married twice, first on March 3, 1882, to Adam Porter in Spring Hill, Nova Scotia, and they had 1 son. Her second marriage was to Peter Shanahan. They married on July 23, 1896, in Amherst, Nova Scotia, and eventually the couple moved to Brockton, Massachusetts. She had another son, Albert, born in 1902, but sadly, he passed away in 1907 at age 5. Esther Cox Shanahan died on a cold Friday morning, November 8, 1912. She was 52 years old and is buried in the Calvary Cemetery in Brockton, Massachusetts, alongside her son Albert and eventually her husband Peter, who died 2 years later in 1914. Few people in Brockton knew of her early fame and connection to the Great Amherst Mystery. The town of Amherst, however, remembers her fondly. Every October, they host the Esther Cox Festival to celebrate the supernatural and paranormal activity that took place in their small town. Esther and her story have been shared hundreds of times. It is featured in songs, books, murals, festivals, and of course in podcasts like this one. Esther has also inspired a very well-known play written in 1991 by Charlie Reindress called Guilty, the story of the Great Amherst Mystery. When it premiered, the show was a huge success and sold out its entire run. However, it wasn't without incident. The cast was subject to many unfortunate events, including broken bones, car accidents, illnesses, and power outages, which many believe were brought on by Esther or the spirits that surrounded her. What makes this play even more spookier is that during the show's run, the region was hit by a hurricane. You'll remember that Esther claimed most of her hauntings were caused by a ghost also named Bob. In 1991, a Category 3 hurricane made landfall in New England. It was the second named storm and first hurricane of the season. It impacted New England, Massachusetts, Maine, and parts of Nova Scotia. The storm caused significant damage and 17 fatalities, making it one of the costliest tropical cyclones in New England's history. The hurricane's name? It was Bob. Meanwhile, as the saying goes, the show must go on, and after Guilty survived the storm, strange occurrences like loud banging and lights flickering happened in the theater. Actors and crew would always blame it on the ghosts and would often say, "Oh, that's just Esther again." So the next time you're in Amherst, Nova Scotia, make sure to take time to explore the area. Who knows? You might have some of your own encounters while celebrating Esther's mysterious life in the town. Thank you for joining me as we explore the stories surrounding the Great Amherst Mystery in Amherst, Nova Scotia. And a big thank you to Shannon, who emailed me and suggested that I cover this story about her hometown. The Edmonton Ghost Tours sponsors Haunted Canada. I will link it in the show notes. Haunted Canada is written and produced by me, Nadine Bailey, with senior producer, Dila Velasquez. Production and sound design is by Rob Johnson, with help from Roslyn Kufer. If you would like to support this podcast, please follow and share. We would also appreciate a like and a 5-star written review. Also, you can follow me on our different social media platforms, or if you have a ghost story, haunting, or true crime that you would like for us to cover on this podcast, please email me through the website hauntedcanada.com. Thank you from all of us at Haunted Canada and Curious Cast. Have a good night, everyone, and stay haunted.